Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling something pretty huge.
We definitely are.
Our mission, really, is to give you that intellectual shortcut into a blueprint for, well, restructuring society.
No small task.
Not at all. We're diving deep into the foundations of what a post-extractive world might look like, moving away from seeing humans as the only thing that matters.
Right, that anthropocentric view.
Towards something based on real ecological ethics.
And we're focusing today on Meta-Sustainable Regionalization Goal 3, Meta-SRG 3 for short.
Which is called?
Regenerative Stewardship and Multispecies Coexistence. Sounds grand, I know.
It does.
But the thinking behind it outlines three really foundational goals. SRGs 12, 13, and 14.
Okay.
And taken together, they're kind of the operating manual for shifting how a region thinks about nature, not as a resource bucket,
Right.
but as like an ethical partner, even a co-governor.
Co-governor. That's a big concept.
It is. We're not talking minor policy tweaks here. This is more like reviewing the core OS update for how we might govern ourselves this century.
Okay, but before we get too excited about the philosophy, there's a major hurdle right at the start, isn't there? The research points to this big tension.
Ah, yes. The regeneration trilemma. That's central.
Tell us about that. It sounds like the core conflict.
It is. It's this fundamental challenge. Governments are being pulled in three really different directions, all at the same time.
Okay, direction one.
First, the basic human need. We still have billions of people needing to be lifted out of absolute poverty, securing basic human dignity. And historically, that's always meant
More production, more resource use.
exactly. Then second, the planetary necessity. We have to decarbonize, like now, and drastically cut our ecological footprint. That demands the opposite, right? Contraction, conservation.
Less stuff, basically.
Less impact, certainly. And then the third pole, which is really the heart of this Meta-SRG 3.
This is the philosophical leap.
It's a huge leap. Moving towards what they call multi-species justice frameworks, giving non-human life actual institutional agency, rights even.
More production for humans, less extraction from the planet, more rights for everything else.
You see the problem?
Yeah, that sounds incredibly difficult.
The painful finding, really, is that under our current ways of thinking, our economic models, our governance structures, these three things are in profound tension.
You can't do all three.
Not if you stick to business as usual. You're basically set up to fail on at least one, probably more, unless you fundamentally change the assumptions of the system itself.
Feels like a guaranteed fail state then. So how does this blueprint even begin to untangle that kind of mess? Where do you start?
Well, it does something interesting. It kind of forces a critical prerequisite right to the front of the line, something that often gets ignored or maybe downplayed.
Okay, what's that?
The key insight, and it really reframes the whole debate, is that you have to secure genuine, sustainable human justice foundations first.
Wait, human justice first for an ecological blueprint.
Seems counterintuitive, maybe. But the research challenges that simple narrative that, environmental goals always come at the expense of human well-being.
Okay, so what's the evidence for putting human stuff first?
It's pretty stark, statistically speaking.
Hmm.
When you look at where the worst environmental disasters happen, where catastrophic famines occur, resource wars, the kind of degradation that forces people to move,
Where does it happen?
overwhelmingly it's in systems marked by autocratic rule, by deep inequality.
Wow.
The point is, these advanced ethical frameworks like multi-species justice, they just can't function if the human society itself is crippled by instability or injustice.
So democracy, rights, equity, they're not just nice ideas.
The findings are explicit. They are the absolute structural prerequisites. You need democratic institutions, strong legal systems, gender equity. These aren't optional extras you add on later.
They're the foundation.
They're the necessary foundation.
Yeah.
Human welfare, stability, justice. That's what you have to build ecological ethics on top of, not in opposition to.
Okay, that makes SRG 12 make a lot more sense then. Regenerative eco-cultural stewardship. It's the essential first step.
Exactly.
Establishing that sort of holistic, relational, justice-centered approach. But you're saying we can't really talk about the trees and rivers properly until the human equity and rights part is solid.
Pretty much. It seems human-centric for an eco-blueprint, but it's about structural integrity.
How so?
Well, the thinking is that securing human justice is necessary for building the kind of complex, consensus-driven governance you need later for multi-species ethics.
Right.
If people are unstable, if they're fighting for basic survival or rights or living under fear, These long-term kind of altruistic goals of regeneration, they're just going to be ignored, pushed aside.
Okay, but when we look at the state of human justice globally, the picture isn't exactly rosy, is it?
Yeah.
The research you mentioned had some startling findings.
It did. It really requires a pause.
Yeah.
We think about democracy spreading over the last century.
Which it did, in waves.
True. But the chilling finding noted was that the total absolute number of people living without democratic rights is apparently higher today than ever before in human history.
Ever. How can that be?
It's about democratic erosion in really populous places.
You mean countries sliding backwards?
Precisely. The research pointed specifically to the reclassification of countries like India. Around 2017, some key metrics suggested it was shifting away from being a full democracy.
And we're not talking about one specific policy here.
No, it's broader metrics. Things like suppression of political opposition, restricting civil liberties, undermining those institutional checks and balances.
Right.
When governance systems covering over 1 billion people start to slide back, while the absolute number of people lacking democratic rights just skyrockets.
And that makes the foundation for any kind of global cooperation, let alone complex ecological stuff, incredibly fragile.
Exceptionally fragile.
And that fragility shows up in the economic data too, right?
Yeah.
Especially around gender parity.
Absolutely. The inequality persists, but the analysis is clear on the cause. It's not some biological necessity. It's structural. It's legal.
Legal barriers still.
Oh, yes. Deeply entrenched. We're not just talking about, subtle cultural biases, though those exist too. We're talking about actual laws on the books.
Like what?
Like laws in some countries that explicitly prevent women from having the same jobs as men, or laws where women don't have equal rights to own property or inherit or even register a business without a male relative's okay?
Wow.
You simply cannot have regenerative stewardship if half the population is systematically shut out from fully participating, legally shut out.
So step one of SRG 12 is literally changing those laws.
It's a core task, removing those statutory constraints.
Okay, I get the focus on legal structures.
Oh.
But culture is powerful, right? Resistance often comes from those deeply ingrained social norms, things people feel are just the way things are. Does the blueprint offer any hope that those can actually change in time?
It actually offers pretty substantial evidence that they can. Social norms aren't fixed artifacts. They're dynamic. They respond to interventions.
Thus, yes.
Well, the research highlights studies showing how things like media exposure can have profound effects, even on deep-seated behaviors.
Tell me about the media example. That sounds interesting.
There was a case study mentioned about introducing cable TV into rural parts of India.
Just access to television.
Yeah. Simply exposing people to different ways of life, different family structures, different gender dynamics, external narratives through mass media, it led to measurable, significant changes.
Like what?
A reduction in son preference, the desire to have male children over female, an increase in women's autonomy within their households, and ultimately that contributed to lower fertility rates.
That's fascinating. So the implication is?
The implication is critical. If relatively passive media exposure can shift something as deeply personal and cultural as son preference, then active, intentional cultural inputs policies, education, media specifically promoting ecological ethics, could potentially cultivate a similar societal shift away from purely human-centered thinking.
So media and cultural strategy become like actual tools of governance under SRG 12, not just background noise.
Operational tools, exactly. And underpinning all of this potential for change is the ultimate catalyst, education.
Always comes back to education.
Especially for women. It's identified as the single most powerful predictor, really.
Yeah.
Literacy, comprehensive education. They drive individual well-being, community health, smaller family sizes.
And critically.
Critically, they enable the level of social and political dialogues possible for new values to even emerge and be discussed.
Is there an example of this working?
The historical example often cited is Kerala in India. Early, sustained investment in education there led to incredibly high literacy rates, and that drove profound social transformations decades ahead of other regions with similar starting points.
So if you want a public that can actually engage with complex ideas like multi-species contracts or what was it, ontological pluralism?
You first need a literate, informed populace. You build the capacity for that conversation.
Okay, so let's assume we achieve that. We have this informed, equitable human foundation. SRG 12 then says these high ethical standards need to be locked in, right? Institutionally. Can't just be optional policy depending on who's in power.
Exactly. This is where it moves from just philosophy or values into hard law. Constitutional law, ideally.
So embedding ecological protection right into the Constitution.
That's the goal, establishing constitutional and legal supremacy for it. Principles of, say, ecological civilization woven into the foundational legal fabric.
Making ecosystem integrity a binding public duty.
A binding obligation, supreme over short-term political whims or economic pressures. So if a politician wants to approve, I don't know, a mining project that clearly violates a constitutional mandate to protect water cycles,
The Constitution says no.
the Constitution should legally override that political decision. It's not just a guideline, it's the supreme law.
Okay, that's the high-level legal mandate. But how does that translate down to the ground? Like a practical tool for planners and local governments. The research mentioned something called Ecological Protection Red Lines, EPRLs.
Yes, EPRLs, they're possibly the most crucial practical mechanism coming out of SRG 12. They're a spatial governance tool.
Spatial meaning, mapping.
Exactly, defining mandatory minimum protected areas on a map. But the crucial part is how they're defined. Not by administrative convenience, not like, oh, let's protect that bit of land nobody wants anyway.
Right, happens all the time.
Instead, ETRLs are determined purely by ecosystem function.
Okay, unpack ecosystem function in this legal sense. What does it actually mean on the map?
It means identifying the absolute minimum areas required for the ecosystem to remain healthy and stable. Think critical watersheds providing drinking water for millions.
Okay.
Or large-scale biodiversity corridors essential for species migration. Climate regulation hotspots like carbon-rich peatlands or old-growth forests. Essential floodplains.
So the science dictates the lines, not politics.
The science of ecological function dictates the lines. The EPRL mechanism then legally designates these areas as basically untouchable for extractive or damaging development.
It forces planning to happen around nature's needs.
Exactly. It flips the traditional planning paradigm. Instead of fitting nature into the leftover spaces after human development, you start with nature's essential functional areas and plan everything else around them.
That sounds incredibly powerful, but it brings us right back to that huge problem you mentioned earlier, the temporal mismatch. The time problem.
Ah, yes, the temporal mismatch. It's arguably the biggest structural flaw undermining long-term goals like this.
How can a political system geared towards, 2 to 6 year election cycles?
Or quarterly corporate reports.
Right. How can that system possibly sustain a multi-generational commitment needed for real ecological regeneration? Soil takes decades. Forests take centuries.
Millennia, sometimes. The system we have is perfectly incentivized for the exact opposite, isn't it? Trade long-term ecological health, which is often invisible or slow, for short-term, visible economic or political gain.
The philosophical answer people often talk about is intergenerational justice, right? Representing future interests, like the 7 generations idea from some indigenous frameworks.
That's the philosophical ideal, yes.
Yeah.
The moral imperative to act as trustees for those not yet born, it's incredibly strong, ethically.
But practically speaking,
Yeah.
you get an election in 2 years, a budget crisis now. How does a philosophical concept actually force a politician to make a potentially unpopular decision that only pays off ecologically in 50 years?
And that is the critical challenge the research really highlights. The philosophy is sound, the moral demand is clear. But the sources are quite frank. They lack clear, actionable mechanisms for how you actually institutionalize that formal representation of the future.
Like, how do you give a future generation legal standing in court today?
Exactly. Do you appoint some kind of future generations commissioner with real veto power? What happens the first time that commissioner blocks a major popular infrastructure project because of its 50-year impact?
Huge political backlash.
Could undermine the whole concept. So the conclusion seems to be that the practical, legal, and institutional nuts and bolts for truly guaranteeing long-term commitment, they remain largely theoretical, unresolved.
Which makes this a major vulnerability for SRG 12's long-term vision.
A very significant one.
Okay, so SRG 12 lays down that tough foundation. Human justice, stable governance, long-term thinking, even if the mechanism for the last one is shaky. Now we get to SRG 13, participatory, multi-species worlding.
This is where it gets really interesting philosophically.
This is the radical pivot, right, where we stop just talking about nature and start trying to bring the non-human world into the governance process itself.
Precisely. And that requires something called ontological pluralism.
Ontological pluralism. Okay, break that down.
That means the governance system has to be able to accommodate fundamentally different ways of understanding what reality is.
Different reality.
Yeah. Recognizing that, say, Western scientific rationalism is one valid way of understanding the world, But maybe an indigenous cosmological understanding of a river as an ancestor is also a valid reality. Or even the measurable physical processes of a volcano, that's another active reality, an agent that governance needs to deal with.
So it's not just accepting different opinions about the same reality.
That's more like epistemic pluralism, acknowledging different sources of knowledge.
Okay.
Ontological pluralism is deeper. It's saying the governance system has to respect and operate with multiple coexisting realities. The river as a water resource and the river as a living ancestor or legal person. Both need to be held within the system, even if they seem contradictory from one viewpoint.
That sounds incredibly abstract. How do you make that work in practice? Does the research point to any real-world examples?
It does. The most concrete functional model discussed is the management framework for the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem.
Yellowstone National Park.
The park and the wider ecosystem, yes. Even operating within conventional park structures, Yellowstone provides a surprisingly comprehensive model of this multi-species governance in action.
Now, so what are they doing differently?
Well, one key aspect is how they give non-human entities functional legal recognition, often through carefully structured prohibitions.
Legal standing by prohibition. Explain that. It sounds like a workaround for the difficulty of granting legal personhood.
It kind of is. It bypasses the often messy legislative process of explicitly declaring a river or a species a person. Instead, they implement really strict system-level rules. Like a total ban on commercial exploitation of the geothermal resources, the geysers, the hot springs, or mandatory non-negotiable minimum distances people have to keep from certain wildlife, or those hydrothermal features.
So by making the integrity of the geyser or the bear non-negotiable.
By functionally prioritizing their needs over potential human economic gain or even just recreational access, the governance structure acts as if that mountain or that geyser or that wolf has rights, even without the explicit legal label of personhood. The prohibition grants functional standing.
Interesting. And Yellowstone goes beyond just protection, right? They recognize non-human processes as active agents.
Yes, this is what's termed institutional recognition of agency. A great example is the Yellowstone Volcano Observatory.
A supervolcano.
Exactly. The observatory isn't just for scientific curiosity. It's a formal part of the management structure. Its continuous monitoring acknowledges the volcano as a core, powerful, unpredictable agent shaping the entire regional system. Management has to respond to its reality.
What else?
Think about fire management. Policies that restore fire's natural ecological role treat fire not just as a hazard to suppress,
That is a necessary process.
as a necessary natural process with its own agency in shaping the landscape. Management has to accommodate and integrate fire, not just fight it.
And then there's the technology angle. The research mentioned something about Fitbits for animals. Seriously.
Haha, yeah, that's a catchy way to put it. They're using really advanced telemetry, GPS collars combined with accelerometers.
On what animals?
Key species like wolves, cougars, elk. These devices continuously monitor incredibly high-resolution data.
Not just where they are, but what they're doing.
Exactly. Activity patterns, stress levels indicated by heart rate variability, even energetics like calories consumed versus burned.
Why track a wolf's steps or heart rate? How does that fit into governance?
It forces what you might call institutionalized listening. This systematic, detailed data forces managers to understand the intricate ecological roles, the energy budgets, the migration corridors of individual animals, not just populations.
So it's data as agency.
In a way, yes. It brings the animal's lived experience and physiological state into the management equation as a core input. It lets managers respond to stress signals, maybe caused by climate change or human activity, with much finer granularity. It moves beyond just counting heads.
Okay, so we have functional rights through prohibition, recognizing process agency like volcanoes and fire, and tech-enabled listening to animals. What about the ontological pluralism part, the different realities?
Yellowstone models that too, primarily through its cultural governance, especially its relationship with the associated tribes.
Now, how many tribes are involved?
The governance framework formally recognizes 27 associated tribes.
And how does it integrate their perspectives?
It actively integrates tribal cosmological interpretations and traditional ecological knowledge into planning, into visitor education materials, into the interpretive centers right alongside the scientific explanations.
So it's not just a token mention.
The goal is genuine coexistence of knowledge systems. It's an institutional acknowledgement that multiple legitimate ways of understanding and relating to that ecosystem exist, and they must co-inform how the place is managed and understood. Science and indigenous cosmology side by side.
That integration seems key, which leads directly to what the research calls the knowledge integration challenge for this whole multi-species worlding idea.
Right, and the interesting point made is that this isn't really a technical capacity issue anymore.
We have the tech.
Ironically, yes, the corporate sector has largely already built the kind of infrastructure needed. Think about big tech companies.
What are they using?
AI-powered semantic layers, unified data clouds, systems capable of ingesting, analyzing, and reconciling absolutely vast, diverse, messy data sets. Structured, unstructured, weather patterns, social media sentiment, supply chain logistics, all of it. The technical infrastructure exists.
But they're using it to sell us more stuff.
Exactly. They're using that incredible capacity for narrow commercial optimization, maximizing clicks, predicting purchasing behavior, driving quarterly returns, not for understanding plural ontologies or managing wolf energetics.
So the capacity's there, but the purpose is wrong.
Precisely. So SRG 13 argues that effective integration for regenerative governance needs three key components working together.
Okay, first the tech piece again.
Right. The technical infrastructure. You need shared digital platforms, common data standards, or ways to translate between them ontologies, systems that can harmonize scientific data, climate models, indigenous oral histories, maybe even real-time animal accelerometer data. And it needs to be accessible.
Not locked away in silos.
Definitely not. Second component tackles the power imbalance.
Which is?
Institutional legitimacy. You can't just collect different kinds of knowledge. You need formal legal mechanisms that give traditional and local knowledge real standing, equal weight.
How do you do that?
Things like co-management boards, where indigenous representatives have real decision-making power, constitutional recognition of traditional knowledge systems, formal advisory committees whose input isn't just optional but required.
Otherwise, the traditional knowledge just gets treated as anecdotes.
Exactly. Marginalized as interesting stories rather than valid data for decision-making. Legitimacy requires structural power.
And the third component, the philosophical glue.
That's epistemic humility.
Humility and knowing.
Yes. Institutionalizing the understanding that these complex socio-ecological systems are fundamentally nonlinear. They're messy. They exceed the capacity of any single knowledge paradigm, whether it's science or traditional knowledge or anything else, to fully grasp on its own.
The system has to admit it doesn't have all the answers.
It has to be designed to perpetually acknowledge its own incompleteness, its own uncertainties. That humility opens the door for genuine integration of diverse perspectives.
And the research cited a specific philosophical tradition for this mindset, didn't it? Not a Western one.
It drew from the Nalanda Buddhist tradition.
What was the key idea?
It emphasizes training the mind to remain, quote, very neutral. And crucially, always to ask why, and to never simply say yes to authority or established dogma.
Constant questioning, critical thinking baked in.
Yes. That intellectual openness, that commitment to continuous critical inquiry, that refusal to accept any single view as the final truth that's presented as the necessary philosophical foundation for SRG 13. It's how you ensure diverse knowledge inputs are constructively challenged and integrated, preventing the system from getting stuck in one rigid, potentially failing worldview.
Okay, so we've got the just human foundation, hopefully, from SRG 12. We've got the institutional capacity to listen to and integrate the non-human world from SRG 13. That brings us to the final piece, SRG 14. Eco-Socio-Cultural Relationships.
This is the synthesis goal, where it all comes together.
Focusing on fostering relational entanglement and aligning those big global goals with place-based wisdom.
Exactly. It's about bridging that huge gap we still see between knowing what needs to be done and actually doing it. Closing the philosophical and operational divide.
And the first step seems to be tackling a really deep-seated philosophical assumption in Western thought.
A big one. Challenging that narrative, often associated with thinkers like Hobbes or maybe Nietzsche, that human nature is fundamentally just self-interested, dog-eat-dog, competitive to the core.
SRG 14 pushes back against that.
It demands a shift, a move towards realizing, or perhaps remembering, that human nature might actually be centered on something else, the taking care of each other, interdependence, oneness.
The research used a really powerful metaphor for this shift, didn't it, from ecology?
The Pando-Aspen Grove metaphor.
Yeah.
It's incredibly evocative.
Tell us about Pando.
Pando is this massive grove of trembling aspen trees in Utah. It looks like maybe 40, 50,000 individual trees, but genetically it's all one single organism, one giant male aspen clone, connected by a vast shared root system underground. It's considered one of the largest, maybe oldest, living organisms on Earth.
So it looks separate, but it's all connected underneath.
Precisely. And that's the metaphor for the mindset shift. Humanity often appears as separate entities, individuals, companies, nations. But SRG 14 suggests we need to recognize we share a single planetary root system. We are fundamentally interconnected.
What happens to one part affects the whole.
If one part of the grove is diseased or poisoned, the whole system suffers. That recognition of deep interconnection is the philosophical heart of SRG 14.
And this isn't just some, modern ecological idea. The research connects it back to classical philosophy, too.
Absolutely. This idea of relational priority isn't new. It aligns directly with mandates from figures like Aristotle or the Stoics. Well, they emphasized the supreme good of man within the context of the comprehensive excellence of the whole community, the polis, the regional system. The Stoics especially had this idea of cosmopolitanism, humans as citizens of a vast community, a public republic that included nature, even the divine, gods and men.
So the idea that individual well-being is tied to the health of the whole system, it's ancient.
It's an ancient ethical mandate that perhaps modern individualism has caused us to lose sight of.
Okay, but knowing this, feeling this connection, that's one thing. Actually making it happen in our current systems is another beast entirely. Which brings us to the really sobering part, the implementation gap.
Ah, the gap. Yes, this is probably the most critical finding, the vast chasm between what we say we value or commit to and what actually happens on the ground, operationally.
And this is where the research brings in the Enron warning. That sounds ominous.
It is. It's a stark warning against institutional hypocrisy, drawn from analysis like Arthur Brooks.
What's the core message?
The message is clear. Any organization, any governance system that loudly proclaims these transcendent ethical values, stewardship, regeneration, justice, whatever, but fails to actually embed those values into its core operating system, its org design.
It's doomed to fail.
It's doomed to fail catastrophically and, importantly, immorally. Just like Enron did with its lofty ethical statements masking deep corruption. Rhetoric without reality is dangerous.
Can we ground this with some examples? Where do we see this rhetoric versus reality gap playing out right now?
Oh, it's everywhere, across all sectors. Look at the corporate world.
ESG reports, sustainability initiatives.
Exactly. Huge amounts of effort, sophisticated reporting on environmental, social, and governance factors. Yet how often does that coexist with the relentless overriding pressure for short-term financial returns?
Pretty often.
If the CEO's bonus, the stock price, the analyst ratings are all still driven primarily by quarterly profits, not by hitting genuine long-term ecological regeneration milestones, then the ESG report is largely just performance.
Window dressing.
It can be, yes. Look at global development, too. We have these incredibly ambitious global commitments, the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Agreement on Climate.
Lots of summits, lots of pledges.
Huge amounts of political energy go into negotiating the commitments. But then you look at the reality. Global fossil fuel production is still increasing in absolute terms. Deforestation continues. The implementation just doesn't match the ambition.
And even in systems that seem designed for top-down implementation.
Even there, the gap persists. The research mentioned examples from highly centralized systems like China, which has embedded concepts like ecological civilization into its constitution and national plans. They have extensive frameworks.
What?
But there are still acknowledged significant challenges in implementation at the local level. Why? Maybe local officials lack the technical capacity or the funding.
Or the incentive.
Or critically the incentives. If their performance is still primarily judged on hitting provincial economic growth targets, and those conflict with complex ecological mandates,
right,
which one do you think wins out in practice?
The economic target.
Usually. Commitments are relatively easy. Genuine structural change, changing the incentive, that's hard, expensive, politically difficult.
So the core lesson from this Enron warning, the real demand of SRG 14, isn't just about having better values. It's about focusing on the boring stuff. The organizational plumbing.
It has to be embedded in the org design, yes. The non-glamorous nuts and bolts of how the system actually functions. You have to fundamentally rewire the incentives that drive behavior.
Oh.
The analysis emphasizes aligning the stated values with how we recognize people, how we reward them, how we incentivize them, to the point of hiring and firing based on it.
Okay, give me a concrete hypothetical example. How would incentives change in a truly regenerative model?
Okay, imagine the head of a regional water management authority. Right now, maybe their performance review, their bonus, is tied to ensuring a certain volume of water allocation for industry and agriculture, maybe maintaining low water prices, keeping stakeholders happy in the short term.
Standard stuff.
Right. Under an SRG 14 model, that whole incentive structure gets overhauled. Their compensation, their career progression, might instead be tied to, say, a verifiable 5-year rolling average of groundwater replenishment rates in their basin.
Measurable ecological outcome.
Exactly. Or achieving specific targets for biodiversity recovery in the river system. Or demonstrating a measured reduction in nutrient pollution flowing downstream. You reward the ecological outcome, not just the resource delivery.
And this applies to leadership, too.
Critically, the system breaks down instantly if leaders are preaching these transcendent values, stewardship, long-term thinking, community. But everyone knows they are personally driven by money, power, pleasure, and fame. That hypocrisy destroys trust and legitimacy faster than anything. The leadership has to embody the values embedded in the org design.
So is the argument that ethics is just org design? That we should stop talking about values and just focus on incentives?
I think it's more nuanced. It's saying that ethics without the supporting org design is just sentiment. It's wishful thinking.
Right.
It doesn't dismiss the ethical mandate that's still primary, but it's a pragmatic acknowledgement that human systems run on incentives. If you want people and institutions to consistently act ethically, especially over the long term, you have to make the ethical path the most rational, rewarded, and recognized path within the system.
Make it easier to do the right thing.
Make it the path of least resistance and the path that leads to success within that system. If you want leaders to prioritize a 50-year forest regeneration plan, you can't just evaluate their performance quarterly.
Okay. Assuming you can achieve that structural integrity, that alignment of values and incentives, what's the practical outcome of this relational entanglement in SRG 14? It mentions institutionalizing the life community.
Yes. That's the operational principle. Governance has to formally institutionalize the understanding that mountains, waters, forests, farmlands, lakes, and grasslands are a community of life.
It's a legal or constitutional principle.
Ideally, yes, a foundational principle that recognizes the interdependence of all these elements, including humans. It's the bedrock for multi-species justice in practice.
How does this operationalize? It requires rethinking urban-rural links.
Completely. SRG 14 demands a mandatory redefinition of urban-rural relationships, moving beyond the historical pattern where cities essentially extract resources and externalize waste onto the surrounding countryside.
Exploiting the periphery.
Right. Instead, it envisions a reciprocal relationship based on mutual dependence and responsibility.
How does that work economically? What's the mechanism?
The core mechanism discussed is eco-compensation. Payments for ecosystem services, essentially, but systematized and mandatory.
Okay, explain eco-compensation.
The basic arrangement is simple in concept, but revolutionary in structure. The countryside, the upstream forests, the farmlands, the wetlands must reliably provide essential ecological security for the entire region.
Like clean air, clean water.
Regulated water flows, flood mitigation, fertile soil, biodiversity, all those services ecosystems provide.
And
In return, the cities and downstream communities who directly benefit from that clean water, stable climate, etc., are required to provide systematic, ongoing eco-compensation back to the upstream stewards.
compensation for farmers, forest managers, communities.
Exactly. To support them in managing the land and water in ways that maintain those vital ecosystem services, it's a direct financial flow acknowledging the value provided.
Can you give a tangible example? How would you calculate and transfer that?
Okay. Think of a large city that gets its drinking water from a river flowing through agricultural land hundreds of miles upstream.
Standard situation.
The city's water utility currently spends, say, millions on complex filtration plants because of agricultural runoff, fertilizers, pesticides, sediment.
Right.
Eco-compensation would involve calculating how much the city saves, or would save, if upstream farmers adopted regenerative practices, cover cropping, no-till, riparian buffers that kept the water cleaner at the source.
The avoided cost.
The avoided cost, or the positive value created. A portion of that calculated economic value would then be systematically transferred, maybe via a water fund, or direct payments mandated by law, to those upstream farmers and land managers who are implementing those beneficial practices.
So it's not voluntary goodwill. It's baked into the system.
It has to be mandatory, collective financing. It links the ecological health of the upstream region directly to the economic well-being of the downstream city and vice versa. It supports the stewards and makes the connection tangible.
Okay, that really brings the relational part to life. We've journeyed through the human foundation, the multi-species worlding, and now this relational accountability. To wrap up this complex integration, the research uses a final analogy, right? Bringing all three SRGs together.
Yes, the symphony analogy. It's a good way to visualize the whole transition, moving from the current fragmented state to something more harmonious.
How does it work?
It suggests that regenerating these complex biocultural systems is like transforming a landscape currently filled with lots of separate, often competing single instrument players or small ensembles.
Like different government agencies, industries, communities, all doing their own thing.
Exactly. Each playing their own score, often out of sync or clashing, transforming that into a vast living symphony composed by the landscape itself.
Imposed by the landscape.
Meaning the composition arises from the ecological realities and the diverse human relationships within that place.
And in this new symphony, what are the roles?
Science provides the detailed sheet music, the data, the monitoring, the understanding of ecological processes, the technical capacity.
Okay.
Indigenous and local knowledge provide the deep timing, the rhythm, the improvisational skill born from centuries of living in that place, the understanding of adaptation, resilience, seasonal flows.
Wisdom component.
The deep compositional wisdom, yes. And governance. Governance acts as the conductor,
Keeping everyone together.
coordinating all these diverse players across different sectors, different political boundaries, different knowledge systems, ensuring the whole symphony is performed cohesively, adaptively, and sustained for the future. It's not a one-time performance. It's an ongoing, adaptive process requiring constant listening, adjustment, and deep commitment from everyone involved.
That symphony analogy really does capture the sheer scale and complexity of what's being proposed. It's quite a vision.
It is. Ambitious, certainly.
So let's recap this deep dive into Meta-SRG 3, Regenerative Stewardship, and Multispecies Coexistence. We started with SRG 12, seeing the absolute need for human justice, democratic accountability, strong legal foundations as the non-negotiable starting point.
The prerequisite, yes.
Then SRG 13 took us into the deep end, institutionalizing non-human agency, using practical models like Yellowstone, embracing ontological pluralism, integrating different knowledge systems with epistemic humility.
And using tools like prohibition and technology to give the non-human world a real voice in governance.
And finally, SRG 14 brought it together with relational entanglement, tackling that implementation gap head-on with the Enron warning demanding systemic accountability, aligning incentives with values, and reshaping urban-rural relationships through things like eco-compensation, building that life community.
Right. And the overarching takeaway, really, looking across all these interconnected pieces, the organizational changes, the governance shifts, the ethical reorientations.
What's the bottom line?
The bottom line seems to be that this massive transition, it's not primarily a technical challenge.
Really? We had the tech, the know-how?
Largely, yes. The monitoring systems, the data integration platforms, the ecological understanding, the governance blueprints. Much of it exists or is readily achievable. The real challenge, the core bottleneck, is one of purpose, justice, worldview, and maybe most importantly, commitment.
We know how to build a more ethical system.
We basically have the blueprints. The fundamental test is whether we possess the collective will, the integrity, the courage to actually institutionalize these ethics, to embed them into the deep structures, the very plumbing of how we govern ourselves and relate to the planet.
Which brings us back to a really profound and maybe uncomfortable tension that ran through the research. Something we touched on early on, the relationship between governance models and these justice outcomes.
Yes, that critical uncertainty.
You saw examples, particularly in the case study material often referenced, of sophisticated ecological governance tools, those EPRLs, the eco-compensation systems being implemented apparently quite effectively within certain non-democratic systems.
That's true. The research acknowledges that reality.
So it leaves us with a really critical, maybe unsettling question for you, the listener, to ponder. Can this kind of deep ecological governance, this multi-species justice, can it actually be institutionalized and sustained reliably over the long haul in systems that aren't democratic, where accountability might be limited, where rights aren't inherent but granted or revoked by central authority?
Or is the reverse true? Is that messy, sometimes slow, but ultimately accountable nature of democratic systems? The open dialogue, the transparency, the enshrined individual human rights is that the absolute non-negotiable prerequisite. not just for preventing human catastrophe, which the earlier points suggested.
But also for achieving genuine, lasting, ethical, multi-species justice. Can you have one without the other sustainably?
It forces you to ask, is ecological justice fundamentally tethered to democratic justice? Or can you decouple them and still achieve a genuinely ethical outcome for the planet? It's a tension that's not resolved in the findings, and it's likely to shape political and ecological debates for decades.
Huge question to leave people with.
And perhaps one final thought, bringing it back to that Enron warning. The research compels us to apply that same harsh clarity to the systems we're part of in our own lives, our workplaces, our communities, even our personal commitments.
Are our actions matching our stated values?
Exactly. If the values we preach, stewardship, fairness, integrity, community, whatever they are, aren't actually reflected in how the system works, how it recognizes people, how it rewards behavior, how decisions are really made, then ultimately those values are just words, just rhetoric on the wall.
The commitment has to be real.
Systemic.
Systemic, structural, and total. That seems to be the ultimate demand of regeneration.